All right. Hello, and welcome back to another fun-filled episode of the Hammercast. I'm your host, Alex, the Hebrew Hammer Salkin, and joining me today is a legend in the world of strength training. You have probably heard of him, and I am very excited to have him on the podcast for the first time, none other than Brooks Kubik. Did I pronounce your name correctly, or is it Kubik?
Cubic, like a
Kubik.
cubic foot.
See, I always pronounced it cubic in my head, and then I thought, wait a minute, maybe I'm just taking like the word cube, which I already know, and I'm just like erroneously applying it to his name. But no, Brooks Cubic. Okay, cool. I second guessed myself for the very last time. We're going to be talking about the old school methods of strength training, why they are every bit as valid for the modern age, and in particular, how to use some of them no matter what age you are to get freakishly strong, break plateaus, and have a good old time in the process, which I think is kind of the most important part. There's no sense in trying to turn something as fantastic as strength training into a boring chore. So we're going to dive into that in a moment. I'm also going to remind my listeners that if you have not already, you should go grab my free 9-minute kettlebell and bodyweight challenge. It is, as the name implies, only 9 minutes long. And I designed it to be done in conjunction with your regular training, not apart from it. So you can use it at the exact same time. A lot of people will like to do it either before the regular workouts. Some people will do it afterward, but it's based around the gait pattern, your body's walking pattern. So you'll use movements like crawling, loaded carries, type of things that you can learn in 30 seconds or less and have a really nice impact on everything else that you love to do. And again, it's free. So, who can say no to that? Just go to 9minutechallenge.com, get your own free copy. And that is the number 9minutechallenge.com, and it is all yours. So without further ado, Brooks, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
I'm very excited to have you on because, I remember early on, I think yours were some of the first articles that I started to read outside of the world of kettlebell training to get a deeper insight into the old school training of the strongmen, the people in the golden and the silver eras of bodybuilding and weightlifting and things like that. And one of the things that I was always most impressed by was like the depth of your research because, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but I mean, you were tracking down this like rare, very hard to find information about these guys training, even like before the internet was the juggernaut that it is now. And I want to ask in particular because you've been at this for several decades. What is your own origin story like? Like, what got you into strength training in particular, especially when I think, at least from my perception, bodybuilding was sort of like the big thing throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. What drew you to strength specifically? And yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. Well, the origin story starts as a young kid with very severe childhood asthma. And my parents took me to one doctor after another, trying to find some kind of cure for this terrible asthma. I mean, I was up all night. I couldn't sleep, wheezing, coughing, unable to breathe. It was just crazy. And nothing worked. And eventually it got to the point where one of the doctors actually said to my parents, he's never going to get over this. It's incurable. There's nothing we can do. Your son will never play sports. He should not go outside and play games. He should take up activities like stamp collecting that he can do inside. He needs to be very careful with what he does. He's essentially an invalid. And I was 9 years old when that doctor made that statement. About the same time, I was a voracious reader. I read everything. And one thing that I liked to read were biographies. They had a whole series in the library, biographies of famous young Americans, and then another one of just biographies of famous young people. And I essentially started with the A's in the alphabet and just read through reading them all. And as luck would have it, I got up to a biography of the young Theodore Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt. And I learned that Teddy Roosevelt, as a young boy, had severe childhood asthma. And his father, when the doctor said they couldn't do anything, his father said, "That's ridiculous." And he built a little gymnasium for the children in the family in one of the rooms of the house. And it was a simple thing with pull-up bars, parallel bars, punching bags, light dumbbells, perhaps light barbells. And it was for all the kids, but mainly for Teddy, because Teddy was in such poor shape. And he started training, and lo and behold, it fixed his asthma. The asthma just gradually went away and disappeared. And he became a very athletic young man. He played many sports in college. He went on to actually run a ranch, be a cowboy out west, did a lot of hunting, lived a very rugged outdoor life, was in the army. He led the famous charge up San Juan Hill during the Spanish-American War. And he was a real hero, and then president of the United States. And as president, for example, he became interested in jiu-jitsu when a Japanese jiu-jitsu team was touring the United States, and the US saw jiu-jitsu for the very first time. And he brought in some American catch-as-catch-can wrestlers and had them work against the Japanese jiu-jitsu experts, and just on a mat in the White House, if you can imagine that. And he got so excited, he actually went down and joined in the fun as president.
Mm-hmm.
One wishes that he were running this time around.
Yeah.
President who can roll up his sleeves and get on the mat would be, with anybody with experts in the martial arts and in wrestling, would be pretty cool.
Yeah.
In any event, I thought to myself, okay, if he can do it, I can do it. That's how I can get over this childhood asthma. My problem was I didn't have a gym. I didn't have any weights or barbells or anything. I'm 9 years old. What am I going to do? And my parents had told me, you can't do anything athletic or active or vigorous. So I hit on the idea of running to school. And every day I would go down the driveway, turn around the corner, past the hedge, blocking my parents' view, and start very slowly jogging, almost a slow shuffle, half a mile to school. And I would force myself to do that without stopping, which was almost impossible. Just half a mile. It was just destroyed me. I would get to school, I would literally find a bush or a tree or something to kind of crawl under and sort of hide from the other kids, because I was just sitting there gasping and sweating, and just lie there for 20 minutes until I recovered. But I would do that every day. My parents never knew what I was doing. And eventually it started to get easier, and then became very easy. And I just realized as time passed that the asthma had gone away as I became able to do that half-mile run to school, which was an amazing thing. I mean, I had no idea that something like that would happen. So that was my introduction to training. It was that simple, running to school to try to cure what you had been told was incurable asthma. Lo and behold, it worked. So then I became, I was able to play sports, and, I'd go down the park and play ball with the other kids, and, do running games and things like that, and started to think about going out for sports when I was in high school. And the sports that interested me were football and wrestling. At the time, so now I'm age 11. At the time, I was 4'11", so pretty short, and I weighed 83 pounds. So I wasn't material to play high school football, and I wasn't material to do high school wrestling. I mean, I wasn't even big enough for the very lightest weight class, the 98-pound weight class. So I realized I had to get bigger, and I thought, weight training would be the way to do that. I'd seen weightlifting magazines, muscular development magazine, strength and health magazine, the Weider magazines. You could see them on the newsstands, the magazine stands. And, I thought, okay, that seems like something that would work. Many of the kids back then would get a 110-pound barbell dumbbell set, 5-foot bar, plates to go on the barbell. They were sometimes metal plates, and sometimes they were the plastic coated Ted Williams type of plates. Didn't really matter, but there were these little barbell sets, and almost all of us had them, but most kids didn't use them. I got one and I used it. And over a period of about 4 months, when I first started training, I put on like 17, 18, 19 pounds. I remember I topped out the first time at about 100, 101, 102, 103 pounds, up from the 83 pounds that I'd started at. So about 20 pounds, which was a huge gain for a little kid. It was like, wow, this is great. I was hooked at that point. Just had to do it. One day, at about that point in time, one Monday, I came down to junior high school gym class, and the junior high school gym teacher had a wrestling mat out. And I was like, wow, this is cool. And I ran and grabbed one of my buddies, and we started rolling around on the mat, having no idea what we were doing. And the coach came over, and it turned out he'd been a former wrestler and a former wrestling coach in high school, and then he became a junior high school coach. But wrestling was, his favorite thing. And so he started to show us some simple moves so that we could demonstrate them to the class. So that was, that was my first introduction to wrestling. I immediately fell in love with it. And my focus then became strength training to become a better wrestler. Mm-hmm. And so I started wrestling in 7th grade, 8th grade, wrestled all through high school. And my life for those 6 years was essentially going to school, working out, wrestling. I was either working out with the weights, or I was running, or I was wrestling. And if I wasn't doing that, I was, eating, sleeping, going to school. But that was essentially my life. Not a bad way to spend your junior high and high school career.
Not at all. Did you ever go back to that doctor who said you'll never be able to do this, that, or whatever, and just say, hey, look at me now?
Yeah, I never did. I really, from the retrospect of, my current age 66, you tend to think back on things in life and think back about conversations you'd like to have. And there are a number of doctors I would like to go back and talk to.
Yeah.
There were allergy doctors. I had very bad allergies at the time, and had allergy shots, weekly allergy shots, twice weekly allergy shots for like all through high school, as did my brother. And it was a really big deal and everything at this allergy clinic in town. They never talked to us essentially about food allergies. They said we were allergic to some foods, but they never got into the whole idea of food allergies and food sensitivities, and maybe that's something to be aware of. And I'd love to go back and talk to them, particularly because, as I've since learned, one of the leading experts in food allergies, a man named Ted Randolph, was a doctor in Chicago at the very same time that I was living in the Chicago, Illinois suburbs, going to this allergy clinic where they never even talked about maybe changing your diet to improve your health outcomes. And I'm thinking, man, what a missed opportunity. What a missed opportunity. I'd like to go back and talk to them. I'd also, jumping forward through life, I'd love to go back and talk to every doctor I ever went to who told me to stop lifting weights, stop working out, resistance training, strength training, weight training, dangerous, bad, you'll hurt yourself, you'll cause heart problems, you'll do this, that, the other, shouldn't do it, you need to go jogging. That was 60s, 70s jogging craze, aerobics. And, that was the standard advice, and it's changed now. But I literally grew up in the weight training will kill you era.
Oh, yeah.
That's literally what we heard. Of course, we also heard from coaches, don't lift weights. It'll make you muscle bound. It's bad for athletes. You don't want to do it. They try to push us away from weight training. Sometimes you'd have coaches who said, if you lift weights, you're not going to be on my team. it was still that mentality back then. And those are people I'd like to talk to also.
Yeah.
They were wrong.
Yes. Oh yeah. And it's funny to think about it too, because now it just seems like such an obvious thing that getting stronger is going to be the thing is going to be at least one of the things that's going to go a very long way at helping you to have more longevity, not just in sports, but in life in general. But one of the things that I find is that, and this is no, I think, criticism of Western medicine in general, but we'll say like doctors are very good at diagnosing and treating illness, but most of them are really not suited for teaching you about health or athletics or anything like that. And so there's like a gulf between people who are interested in strength training, or we'll say old school bodybuilding, not necessarily like the sport as it is now, but we'll say bodybuilding or muscle building. Um, or personal trainers as a whole, and doctors. They're close because ostensibly they have the same goal, which is to make you well. But on one side of the spectrum is the doctors who are more focused on trying to keep you from being sick. And then there are the people who are trying to focus on getting you well. And I think that the two sides need to have good communication with each other in order to know how to bridge the gap between those two professions. But it seems like there's not a lot of communication between the two, uh, either by decision, like, you know, just this is just the way we've always done it, or just by, happenstance. It's hard to say, but it is interesting to see that the wheels do turn and times do change, but it takes a very long time because nowadays it doesn't seem like doctors are as opposed to strength training as a whole, and coaches for athletics are certainly not opposed to it. I think they were quicker adopters of it, but it's just a weird thing to think that was ever like a controversial decision. I know, oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank on his name. John Saxon, who was Bruce Lee's co-star in Enter the Dragon,
Yes.
was also told don't lift weights, so on and so forth. But he did it anyway, and he said, "Look, I noticed I was getting faster, I was getting more powerful, so I wasn't going to listen to what the coaches were saying. I was going to listen to what I could observe." When you started to observe these things as well, and you started to notice that your wrestling got better, you were getting stronger, all those things you were told you were never going to be able to do, did that start to change the minds of some of the people who were your coaches and trainers that you saw around you, or were they pretty stuck in their ways?
Um, it was mixed. I went to two different high schools,
Hmm.
and the answer would be different for the two different schools.
Interesting.
I have somewhat recently learned, and it's amazing I didn't know this in high school, but I went to Rich East High School in Park Forest, Illinois, for 3 years. We had at least three coaches at the high school who are in the Illinois Hall of Fame for coaching.
Wow.
Coach George 𝐵𝑜𝑑𝑦𝑤𝑒𝑒𝑖𝑔ℎ𝑡 who was football coach and athletic director. He's in both of those Hall of Fames in Illinois. Coach Ken Nordquist, Illinois State Hall of Fame wrestling coach, and Coach Skip Dunn, Leo Dunn, again, Hall of Fame, Illinois Hall of Fame wrestling coach. And amazingly, I started high school, I graduated in 75, so I guess I started in 71? About 1965, 66, those coaches and some others were reading about weight training and weight training for athletes. And they were reading about, there were some books by Bob Hoffman from the York Barbell Company.
Hmm. Oh yeah.
Oh, right. So still wear the shirts, of course.
Nice.
So they actually rented a big truck, a U-Haul truck, and all the coaches drove from Illinois to Pennsylvania, to York, Pennsylvania. And they did like a couple of days special training program with the York coaches and weightlifters and athletes, learning how to, basic weightlifting, weight training, how to implement it for athletes. Bought 10,000 pounds of weights, loaded up the U-Haul, took it on back. Okay. Set up a weight room in an empty classroom. and it was a weight room that was specifically for the football players and the wrestlers. And it was mandatory that if you were on those teams, you trained in the weight room with the weights. Well, I just mentioned that we had 3 coaches from that group who are in the Hall of Fame. That should tell you how good they were.
Mm-hmm.
Year or two after that happened, there was a guy, Max Branham, won the state championship, undefeated as a junior in wrestling, won the state championship his junior year. The next year, finished second, beating the kid he had beaten in the championship, or losing the kid he had beaten in the championship match the year before, undefeated up to that point. So essentially one of the best wrestlers in the history of Illinois wrestling. And he came out of that program and out of that weight training group. I've looked up the yearbooks on classmates.com. Interesting thing that you can do.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the guys on the wrestling team after they got that weightlifting program in, they're big, they're strong, they've got thick necks, broad shoulders. They don't look like little boys. They look like men. They look like college athletes. It's just absolutely amazing. The football players show the same development. In the football photos, you can see their necks. And it's like, man, those guys were doing a lot of working out, a lot of lifting. Really cool. And they were undefeated. They had one year where I think they gave up something like 18 points were scored on the defense over the course of the whole season.
Wow.
Undefeated football season, and they just blow people out of the water. It was absolutely amazing what they accomplished. Well, I didn't know that. I just knew that the first time I saw that weight room, I was in 8th grade and no, 7th grade. I was in 7th grade and I went over to a wrestling program for the junior high school kids that they ran for a couple weeks at the end of the high school season. And I saw that weight room and it was like, oh man, I got to start training or I can do something. And so I started training there even when I was in junior high. It was just like, it was heaven. But so it was very natural it was very natural to think, well, of course you worked out, of course you did it. And the coaches that I worked with had that mindset. Some of the other coaches at the high school did not, but that was okay. They had their thing. We had our thing, but everybody trained. If you didn't lift weights, you did a lot of body weight calisthenics and a lot of running and sprinting and other things. But everybody was working out all the time for their sport. There were coaches at other schools, though, who were dead set against weightlifting, weight training, would not let their athletes go near it. Some of them used body weight training. Some did a lot of, pull-ups, dips, rope climbing, very popular things, ring work. Others, not so much. They just relied on the sport, thinking they would build enough strength. So it was a mixed bag. Then I went to a different high school for my senior year that was in Illinois, Beaver Creek High School in a suburb of Dayton, Ohio. And they had a very strong wrestling program that did not emphasize weight training or strength training at all. And I think I was the only guy that year who worked out. I did weight training to supplement the wrestling. And that's absolutely amazing to me. I can't believe it. And I didn't work out at school. They had a weight room at school. I never even set foot in it. I trained at a college that my dad worked at, Wilmington College in Wilmington, Ohio. So every day I would go to wrestling practice, work out we'd usually go 2.5 hours or so, get in the car, drive 30 miles to where my dad worked, work out there, and then drive him home. He worked out there. He lived there, but worked at school, lived at home. So I was sort of like the chauffeur, if you will.
Yeah.
But that was okay because that let me work out at Wilmington College, which is where I wanted to work out. So I was always training. In Illinois, I had tons of support on the training front from the coaches. In Ohio at Beaver Creek, I was completely on my own. If I had never touched a weight, if I had never done any training other than wrestling practice, the coaches could have cared less. And they didn't know, they probably didn't even know I was doing it.
Yeah. It's incredible, like I said, to look back and think now, like what a difference that must have been. Like you were probably like a superstar when you were wrestling in Ohio versus when you were in Illinois, where it was just much more common to actually lift weights. Was there like did people notice a big difference in your abilities, or that sort of like evened out at that point just with the amount of body weight training or just wrestling technique that they had?
Um, I was a top wrestler in both states.
Mm-hmm.
Was a state champion in Illinois in Greco-Roman wrestling,
Mm-hmm.
um, and was in a very competitive part of the state where, where I was at Rich East High School my junior year, Rich Central High School, 10 miles down the road, won
Mm-hmm.
the state championship, the team championship. I wrestled against a number of state champions and state place winners and really top kids, and was very competitive in that program. One of the guys I went to school with, guy who was a senior when I was a junior, was an undefeated state champion, pinned virtually everyone that he wrestled. After winning the state championship in Illinois, went to the junior nationals, won the junior nationals. I mean, he was literally one of the very, very best wrestlers in high school, his weight class. So I was used to seeing really, really good kids and good competition. In Ohio, I finished third in state in the regular Ohio Wrestling Championships. I'd been going, obviously, aiming for the state championship, but third was pretty good. That was as high as anybody had placed in our school in the school's history. It was interesting moving from one state to another. The wrestling styles were somewhat different. And there was a big change in that when I was in Illinois in the Chicago suburbs, I was in like the hotbed of wrestling,
Mm-hmm.
with all the really premier kids. And the premier kids in Illinois were like among the best in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And the ones would go to, they'd wrestle Division I schools. A lot of them, I knew guys who went to Iowa, wrestled under Dan Gable.
Wow.
It was, really, really high level of competition. In Ohio at that period of time, the hotbed of wrestling was in Northern Ohio, particularly in the Cleveland area. And they had some really, really good coaches and incredibly good teams. And some of the best wrestlers, some of the best high school wrestlers in the country. Down in Dayton and Cincinnati, Southern Ohio, they were not as competitive. They were really working hard and building the programs, but we were really outmatched by the guys in the Cleveland area.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a change, going from an area that was like the hotbed to an area that was trying to break in and trying to be one of the guys from the area that wasn't as good, the part of the state that, was really working to be competitive and try to help pull them up,
Mm-hmm.
and pull them in. I had crazy shoulder injury. I've never had a diagnosis of exactly what it was wrong, but it was essentially probably a rotator cuff tear or partial tear right here on my right shoulder.
Mm.
Real problem because I'm right-handed. And that happened about 2/3 of the way through the season. It got progressively worse. And I had matches in the qualifying series for the state championship. My shoulder was really bad. I would shoot in for a single leg, for example, and the other guy would block, hit my arm, and bang, arm partially out of joint, not able to use it, wrestling like this, one-handed with my left hand.
Yeah.
And there were matches against really good kids that I absolutely had to win. And I had to do it one-handed with my shoulder just, completely gone. So just getting to the state championship was, I thought, pretty good.
Yeah.
In the state tournament, I ended up placing third. In the final match of the season, I was ahead by 1 point. Arm was out of joint, wrestling one-handed. I'm in the top position. The guy stands up, and if he gets away, it's a 1 point getaway, and we're tied, right? Which I didn't want because bad arm, right? I don't want to hold that lead. So he stands up. I pick him up, left hand, slam him down. He gets up again, same thing, slam him down. He gets up a third time, slam him down. This time he bounces away and almost free. And instinctively, I shoot out the right arm, and I catch him right on the upper thigh, and I'm still holding on to him, so it's not an escape. And he's trying to pull away, and I'm trying to pull back, and he's standing there and just like pulling forward, and I'm pulling back. I remember one of the cheerleaders yelled 13 seconds. And during that 13 seconds, as he kept trying to pull away, my hand goes from upper thigh to knee to shin to foot. And I'm holding on to his foot, and he's trying to kick free. And I'm just sitting there holding on. And you can imagine what it was doing to my shoulder.
I'm cringing just thinking about it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's bringing back painful memories. But
Giving me painful memories.
yeah,
I wasn't even there.
But in any event, I held on. I won the match by 1 point, and never wrestled in college because for about the next 2 years, I really couldn't use my arm or shoulder.
Wow.
I would go on a date with a girl, and if she was sitting on the side at a movie, if I want to put my arm around her, it's like into two hands, and then like that.
Wow.
I just couldn't, do anything with it. Now that was back in the day. I know a lot of people are going to be like, well, what about sports medicine, dude, surgery, physical therapy, all that. It's like, we didn't have that back then.
Yeah.
There was virtually no sports medicine, at least for the high school level. I mean, maybe they did college and university, certainly for the pros, although it was very primitive compared to where it is now. A lot of surgeries were basically career-ending surgeries.
Yeah, they would just lock your joint down.
Yeah, they just didn't work very well. And I never got a real diagnosis, and I never got referred to a PT, an athletic trainer, a sports med specialist, an orthopedic surgeon. I just went to, I guess I must have been referred to an orthopedic surgeon, but not someone with a sports background.
Yeah.
But they just, they were like, can't figure out what's wrong, don't know what to do. Maybe it'll get better on its own. And, so I've dealt with that shoulder and shoulder problems ever since.
Mm-hmm.
And there were, I think, a lot of kids in my era who, if they had an injury, you really had no resources to deal with it. Sports med was not there, and you couldn't get on the internet. Nowadays you can get on the internet, you can figure out, it looks like this is the problem, this might help. Certainly physical therapy and physical therapists are accessible nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
Many of them are very, very good, very, very skilled. Probably would have worked wonders with my shoulder. But back then there was nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. It's crazy to think. I mean, people don't realize just how much of a wild west it was even not that long ago in terms of strength training and sports and things like that. It was like night and day difference from what we have now. Something that you mentioned earlier too, this is something I'm very curious about because you mentioned, wearing your York barbell shirt with, of course, Bob Hoffman being really, I would say probably the somewhat modern founder of strength training in America versus Joe Weider, who is really much more well known for the bodybuilding side of things and the explosion of interest in bodybuilding that really continues to this day. I mean, I don't need to tell you this, but Arnold Schwarzenegger is famous largely because of Joe Weider. Um, Now, I don't remember who it was. I think this was maybe in the 1920s. Somebody said this. Show me basically for every one person who wants to lift like Eugene Sandow, I will show you 100 people who just want to look like him. So the idea of looking good is something that people have always sort of been drawn to. And given that you were familiar with Weeder's magazines and books and things like that, but that you also were familiar with what Bob Hoffman put out. Bob was, in some sense, let's say, unfortunately, less popular, perhaps for that reason that there are just a lot more people who would like to look great and don't care as much about strength. What drew you to the Hoffman style of old school strength training versus only being drawn toward like what many other people are, just looking good in Joe Weider's style? Was there anything in particular that you felt of the Hoffman style fit you better, or was it just pure happenstance that that's just what you happened upon?
Well, I was always interested in training for sports.
Hmm.
So obviously you're focusing on strength and power.
Yeah.
Um, the problem was back then there were very few sources of information about training for athletes as opposed to training in general. And we all worked on the assumption that in order to get stronger, you had to increase the size of your muscles.
Hmm.
So to get stronger, you build bigger muscles. Bigger muscle equals stronger muscle. Stronger means better athlete. Okay. So if that's the way you're looking at things, which is a very simplistic way of looking at things, but it's the way people thought back then, including Hoffman.
Hmm.
If you're looking at things from that perspective, if you see a bodybuilding magazine with a big bodybuilder on top, you think to yourself, gee, if I had muscles like that, I could be a better athlete. Because with big muscles, that guy must be really strong. If he's really strong, he must be a great athlete. I want muscles like that. And
Hmm.
we all thought that way. So as kids, we weren't really separating things out. And the magazines didn't do that at all. Joe Weider actually had a magazine about training for sports called All American Athlete that he ran for a while, and then it folded because there wasn't as much interest in it. The crazy thing was, a lot of the routines in that magazine were essentially bodybuilding routines.
Hmm.
But we didn't, as kids, we weren't separating these things out that much in our mind.
Yeah.
Um, Nowadays, I think there's much more of a recognition among strength training professionals, coaches, uh, trainers who work uh, with athletes and with a more highly skilled population. I think there's much more of a sense that bigger muscles are not necessarily stronger muscles. They may or may not be, but it depends on many other factors.
Hmm.
In some sports, bigger muscles are contraindicated. They can interfere with athletic performance. Certainly a high jumper, for example, who concentrates on upper body training to gain as much upper body mass as possible, is merely adding extra weight that he has to drive, propel over the bar.
Yeah.
Doesn't make sense. Um, we've learned a lot more about speed training. We've learned a lot more about developing power as opposed to strength. We have a big divide between powerlifting type workouts, bodybuilding workouts, Olympic lifting workouts, kettlebell training, body weight training, combinations of these methods, and people see all these in play, and they really they've started to challenge the old assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've come to realize, from a sports training perspective, building big muscles was not really the thing you wanted to do. It may come along as a byproduct of other things. It's important for football, up to a point, but it's not that simple. Boy, if I had muscles like the guy on the cover of the magazine, I'd be unstoppable as an athlete. It's not that simple at all. I think people are realizing that more and more, but they weren't. We didn't back then.
Mm-hmm.
Nevertheless, I always had a sense, and I followed authors like Bradley J. Steiner, for example, who wrote for Perry Rader's Iron Man magazine and the York magazines. I always had a sense that it was important to train for strength.
Yeah.
To push the poundages. Progressive strength training is the name of the game. So go for the high poundages. Now, in all honesty, I would have loved to have looked like Mr. America and have been really strong and have been, a champion athlete in the sport of my choice. But, of all of those, the most important thing was being a good athlete.
Mm-hmm.
And then after high school, when my wrestling career was over, it was more, I want to be strong, I want to stay strong, I want to get stronger, which eventually led to an interest in powerlifting.
Mm-hmm.
And I moved into more powerlifting oriented training. More, late 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something that was becoming much more popular at that point in time. Olympic lifting in the United States was on a precipitous decline. We'd gone from being literally the best in the world to just not competitive at all.
Yeah.
There wasn't much interest. There were very, very few gyms that had the facilities to do Olympic lifting. There were very few people who knew how to do it. Coaches were few and far between. That wasn't accessible. And I in my early career, I never really considered that because there was just nowhere to do it, and it just didn't seem very interesting. The magazines weren't pushing it at all.
Yeah.
Including Hoffman's magazines, which was crazy because he called himself the father of weightlifting in America and had funded the USA weightlifting team since the 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
And was kind of, he himself was losing interest in the sport, by the, definitely by the 1970s and into the 1980s.
Certainly. Well, this brings up an interesting topic then, because you mentioned the magazines, which were obviously a lot more common back then. But I think of now, I still tend to look toward what the old timers did, because my rationale is, what, if it worked under worse circumstances, but less knowledge, less accessible, conveniences that we now take for granted, then it stood the test of time and it still works now, then it's worth spending a bit of time on. But it's so easy for me to use the internet and just look up like, oh, I wonder what John Grimmick wrote about, regarding such and such topic. Or, there are whole, like, I'll give a shout out to, I think it's Anthony DiTillo, the tight tan slacks of Dejoban. I don't know if you've ever seen that website. Yeah, it's just chronicles these incredible articles from, from the 30s, 40s, 50s, sometimes even before then, on the topics of bodybuilding and powerlifting and Olympic weightlifting. But it's easy now because I just sit down in one spot, type something in, and it just pops up. But apart from, just the magazines that were on newsstands that you could pick up on a monthly basis, did you have to do anything special to do any research into some of the older stuff, like getting a hold of Hoffman's older magazines, and things like that? Like, how hard was it to access this information that was either no longer in print or no longer of interest to the majority of the strength world?
When I was a kid, I started reading Perry Rader's Iron Man magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And Perry Rader's Iron Man magazine had classified ads in the back, and you had some sellers of old books, old courses, old magazines. Small group of people were interested in those mainly as collector's items, but you can get them for training information as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I started sending away, you'd send a quarter or some postage stamps through the mail and get a couple little magazines or a flyer of someone's price list, what they had or whatever. So I started reading about what we would now call old school training information in that form. For some reason, I did not go back and buy back issues of magazines. I'm not really sure why. But that wasn't really my thing. But I did get old courses and old books and things. There was a man, Bill Hinburn, Hinbern. Bill lives in Michigan. And about the time that I got interested in training, Bill's a few years older than me. He started a little business where he was selling old stuff. And then he hooked up with Reg Park, Mr. Universe winner, to sell Reg Park's training courses in North America.
Wow.
Okay, Park lived overseas. He was from England, and at that time he was living in South Africa. So Bill is selling those. It becomes a nice little mail order business for him. And he comes up with the idea of reprinting old books and courses. So he starts a business where he's selling reprint editions, modern reprint editions of old courses from the 1890s, 1900s, 1920, 1930, whatever. Okay. And he continues that to this day. It's at superstrengthbooks.com. It's a great resource. And if you go there and go through all the titles that Bill sells, I bought all of them over the years. And I learned a tremendous amount from those resources. And I also learned who was the most interesting to me, whose information was most valuable. And then I would go and search out other things by that person. Then that was much of the background that I had with me when I wrote my first book, Dinosaur Training, Lost Secrets of Strength and Development, which was published in 1996. When I started making that book available, it made a huge splash. I mean, it was just unimaginable how hard that hit the strength training world, how much of a response. And part of that response was people saying, hey, I know you're interested in stuff. I've got these old books. I've got these old courses. I've got these old magazines. And that's when I started a collection of old magazines and eventually built up a collection where I had virtually everything that had been published about strength training, weightlifting, weight training, since the 1900s. And went back through all of that, went through all the original source materials, and just learned a tremendous amount going back to the 20s and 30s and 40s, things that we should not have forgotten, but we did forget. As I said earlier, there was a time when we had the best Olympic weightlifting team in the world. And we had magazines you could buy on a newsstand in the United States, and you could read the exact training programs that those men followed. And everybody's forgotten that. It's just absolutely amazing. Do you know who read those magazines and studied them and built upon them? The Russians.
Of course.
Yeah. I mean, the basis of Russian training knowledge was American magazines from the 40s.
Yeah.
That the Russians read, and they tried what was in there, and they built upon that knowledge base.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned that too, because people forget. I think a lot of us have a tendency to think that it was sort of pioneered in some sense by the Russians, but it was not like all in one direction. I think we've certainly learned a lot about, Soviet research and that sort of a thing, but in many ways they grabbed the baton from the American scene. And I mean, even as late as I believe the 1980s, the Russians sent people over to learn from George Friend, if I'm not mistaken. And he was one of the original members of the original West Side Barbell, for people who are not familiar, prior to Louis Simmons taking over. And this is no disrespect to Louis Simmons, just mentioning that it was, prior to when Louis Simmons was a part of it. And they took copious notes, and they applied George Friend's approach. And he, just for anybody who's curious, I mean, he had incredible power lifts that put him like in a competitive league, in addition to being one of the top track and field athletes at the time. I mean, he could throw a discus like across the state practically. I mean, he was just an unbelievable athlete. But yeah, it's so interesting you mentioned this, because it was all this information was right there in front of us. And then our communist enemies who were trying to bury us, they were reading all of the stuff that you could have gotten from a newsstand and applying it, and excelling in the Soviet Union.
It really is remarkable. And if anybody is interested in this, the Sportivny Press website that Bud Charnaga puts together is really interesting. Bud Charnaga did translations of Russian training books.
Interesting.
Okay, and the Russians, leave aside all the drug issues. I don't mean to discount or minimize those, but the Russians had a sports training program before the collapse of the Soviet Union that was just absolutely incredible. You could basically get a PhD in being a weightlifting coach, or being a track and field coach, except not all events, but like one event, like, to train high jumpers, to train distance runners, to train hammer throwers, whatever. These were PhD level programs. And people would study, and they would come out with this incredible wealth of knowledge that, in the West, we had completely forgotten, and the only sources of training information that we had were magazines.
Yeah.
Okay. Written by people who may or may not have had valuable information, may have had information that worked in their day, but was 20, 30, 40 years outdated and had never been updated or integrated into modern training practices. May have been not so good as the training practices of people from 40, 50, 60 years ago, right? But we had just such a small fraction of training information, and they just had massive detailed amounts. And Bud has a lot of this on the Sportivny Press website. So if anyone is interested in that, that's a really good resource with tons of fascinating articles. One thing that he focuses on is the commercialization of knowledge. And basically, he says, not saying Soviet Union or communism is a perfect system. That's not the message at all. But it leads to different results if you have university level programs in sports training, in training for all sports, as opposed to kids having to figure it out on their own.
Yeah.
Like me at 11 years old, reading Muscular Development Magazine, Strength and Health Magazine, the Weider magazines, Perry Rader's Ironman magazine, going to the library, finding the 2 or 3 books that were available on the bookshelf that had some very basic rudimentary knowledge about, or rudimentary information about strength training, getting some courses from Bill Hinburn, and trying to put all of the information together. And I'm 11 years old, and do I really know what I'm doing? Maybe I do it better than I would have done if I hadn't done all that reading and studying. But, it was a struggle.
Yeah.
And really didn't have anybody, none of us had anybody who said, okay, look, here's what you should do. Here's how you should train. Here's, do this, boom, boom, boom. Try this. That's not working for you. Do this. Those types of resources just were not available to us here. Some
Yeah.
people did very well on their own with things that they developed on their own. A lot of people probably didn't achieve their full potential, in part because their training was not as good as it could have been.
Yeah. I think that's a positive and a negative of that pioneering spirit in the US. It's like figuring things out on your own is just kind of part and parcel of what we do here. Which, helps for some people. Like I mentioned George Friend earlier, he just tested things out, saw what worked. And in his case in particular, it was the sort of a thing that was so good that the Soviets wanted to just send people over to learn about it. But then when it comes to like a smaller level, this is one of the things that I'm really dedicated to because I was very similar to you in that, I didn't have asthma growing up, but I was scrawny, unathletic, weak, uncoordinated, perennially picked pretty close to last for most team sports in school. I didn't really come into my own stride until I was very late teens, early 20s. And, my whole thing is I want to try to guide people who are in similar circumstances and maybe a bit older and show them, like it's, I wouldn't say shortcuts, but certainly a faster lane to get to where they're going. And I think there's more of that now. The only, of course, there's always going to be some drawback. And I would say one of those is that now there's just so much information that it's hard to determine, the wheat from the chaff. And so, my hope is that as time goes on and, some of the resources you mentioned that people will seek out these resources. Of course, selfishly, I also want people to seek out my own resources because that's what I'm here for. But I think you make a good point. Like there's a bit less guidance in some sense in the U.S. versus in other countries, and I would venture a guess that it's probably somewhat similar in China, given that they are renowned for basically taking they have like a whole system for figuring out who's going to excel at what kind of sport from a certain age, and then they'll put them in the sport, and then they'll weed out the people who don't look like they're going to go much further, and then they'll put all this effort into the ones who will essentially be able to compete on the world stage and win these big medals and all sorts of respect for the country. And I think in the Soviet Union it was roughly similar, whereas a lot of the people will take weightlifting, for example. Somebody pointed out to me once that one of the reasons we don't do all that well in weightlifting is because all the type 2 fiber heavy guys go to football, and
Yeah.
other sports where people are making tens of millions of dollars as opposed to weightlifting, which is, in my opinion, way cooler, but it pays pennies, if anything, and most people don't have that kind of a desire to do that sort of a thing. Shifting gears a little bit, one of the big parts of old school strength training that I've been very happy to see making a comeback is body weight training. And, all the old timers did it, from the weightlifters to the wrestlers to the bodybuilders. And normally, I have a tendency to give away the, surprises when I talk to people before I even hit record, but I didn't do it this time because I wanted to show you that I have
Mhm.
this great book. This is Dinosaur Bodyweight Training by Brooks Kubik. But I want to show you something even cooler because this interaction we're having is actually not our first one. You signed it for me back in, this was 2017. I bought this and it was a phenomenal book, like excellent resource with variations I had never seen or heard from, or never seen or heard of before. And so I'm very curious on the body weight side of the equation. How much of this was stuff that you came up with from your own experimentation, and how much of it is stuff that you were able to cull from some of these old books and magazines and things like that?
Uh, Probably about half and half. there was a wealth of body weight training information back in the old days.
Yeah.
And the reason was simple. It was because a lot of people didn't have weights. There were very few gyms, and barbells were not mass marketed, mass produced. A lot of guys trained with whatever they could use for resistance. And of course, body weight training, using the body as a form of resistance, is the simplest thing. I mean, if you're a kid on a farm in Nebraska, for example, in 1925, and you want to get bigger and stronger, what are your options? You don't have that many. Body weight training is one of the very best. So a lot of the magazines offered body weight training courses. Charles Atlas famously sold a body weight training course. Everybody thinks it's dynamic tension, some form of manual resistance isometrics. That's actually a very small part of the Charles Atlas course. I mean, it's deep knee bends and sit-ups and push-ups, and those are the primary movements in the course, which were very accessible to the farm boys. But then from there, obviously, you can build on those by going to more difficult movements. And body weight training, if you look at what was done in gyms in Europe, they had all kinds of body weight exercises. Rope climbing was big, climbing ladders, horizontal ladders. They had unusual types of apparatus for body weight work that you don't even see anymore. For example, parallel bars, the old-fashioned, not dipping bars, but parallel bars, such as you would use for gymnastic exercises. Okay, they were in every gym. And they also had, in many gyms, what were essentially parallel bars, but they were at a 45-degree angle. Okay. Have you ever seen those in a modern gym? I've never seen them in a modern gym. But think about that. If you use those for push-ups, you can have your face up and do this 45-degree push-up with your hands on the handles. But you can also reverse the movement with your face down. Think about that. Heck of an exercise, but it's completely forgotten. Nobody does that or would think of doing that. But there were all kinds of great body weight exercises. And a lot of the weightlifters of the era, definitely a lot of the wrestlers of the era, but a lot of the weightlifters of the era did plenty of body weight training. I mean, gymnastics was often a big part of the training. Handstand training was really, really big. The first Olympic gold medalist in the United States in weightlifting, Tony Terlazzo, who won in 1936, did tons and tons of handstand push-ups. Big surprise. John Grimmick, the greatest bodybuilder of the era, a very good weightlifter as well, a United States champion in weightlifting, set 2 unofficial world records in the military press. Grimmick worked as an artist's model, and he would work as an artist model at colleges and universities and art schools. So he would travel from Ivy League colleges to Chicago, kind of do a little circuit and stop and work as a model at various locations. At some of those locations, he could find a place to do weightlifting. At others, he couldn't. And when he couldn't, he would do body weight workouts, including, for example, 20 sets of 10 reps in the freestanding handstand push-up and 20 sets of 10 reps in the tiger bend push-up, freestanding.
It's incredible.
So you look at, no joke, incredible. So you look at photos of Grimmick and that incredible shoulder and tricep development, and it's like, Was that weightlifting that did that? Or was that these insane body weight workouts that he did? Or was it a combination?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Grimmick, by the way, came from Perth Amboy,
Perth Amboy, New Jersey, right?
yeah, Perth Amboy, New Jersey, and lived in the Slovak part of town, which also was where the very, I think the very first, and I know the national headquarters of the Sokol movement in the
Mm.
US was located at that period in time. The Sokol movement being, physical fitness, natural movement, gymnastic movement, physical training is developed in Czechoslovakia.
Interesting.
Okay. And so he's literally, little John is a couple blocks down the street from the national headquarters. And I'm thinking to myself, little John probably walked by that so-called gymnasium and wandered inside because his big brother was training in there and looked at what they were doing and said, that looks like fun, I want to do it. And so a part of the Grimmick story that we don't know about probably involved being in that kind of program from a very early age, along with all the other kids in the neighborhood. And so they would just naturally do it and do it at the playground and do it at the beach and, whatever. It was just like the thing to do. What else are you going to do? It's
Yeah.
like playing baseball or playing football. If you're a kid in that area, you do it. And that was one of the things that they did. And I don't think anyone ever focused on it because it was just a natural part of growing up. They didn't think about it. And then also there's a commercial motive because if you're trying to sell barbells, you don't want to dwell too much on that sort of thing because you're afraid it'll cut into your barbell sales.
Of course.
So, who knows? If I'd love to be able to have a conversation with John Grimmick about exactly that.
Yeah.
Fortunately, we never will, but that would be interesting. John Davis, one of the greatest weightlifters in the history of weightlifting, a two-time Olympic gold medal winner, a six-time world champion. At one time, he held all of the world records in the heavyweight class. He held all of the US records, the Pan American records, the world records, and the Olympic records. Every single record he held. He was an American. He grew up in Brooklyn, grew up doing body weight exercises at a little park in Brooklyn, along with the other kids. And they had pull-up bars and dipping bars and rings and, maybe some low bars. And that's what he trained with. That's what they all trained with. He got so strong doing that when he turned to actual weightlifting, within 2 years, he was the world champion at age 17.
Wow.
Beating a former world and Olympic champion from France and a former world and Olympic champion from Austria. Beat both of them in his first world championship at age 17. And his background was purely bodyweight training. Now, I learned that in my 50s. What I wouldn't give to have learned that, to have known that when I was starting out at 11 years old.
Yeah.
Because I might have thought, okay, this weightlifting stuff is really good. I'm going to keep doing that, but I'm going to add to it, these other exercises. If I had had resources available to me, such as, convict conditioning 1 and 2, your 9 exercises in 9 minutes course, free course, I'd be like, bang, get it, good price.
Yeah.
If I'd had that kind of thing and could have supplemented the very meager, basic beginner level of knowledge I had about weight training, wow, boy, you're like, missed opportunity.
That's it's the one of the things that I think is still crazy is just how much of a surprisingly well kept secret calisthenics is, because it was the sort of a thing that was, you pointed out, It was used by champions. It was used by people just looking to get in better shape. But that remains the case. And I think a lot of people look at it and they think this is too simple and too uh, accessible. There's no way that it's this powerful, but it really is. And, even just thinking about the volume, for instance, that John Grimmick did with the freestanding handstand push-ups, like 20 sets of 10 is a lot. But, you can get away with incredibly high volume work with body weight training far easier than with weight training. It just doesn't have the same impact on the nervous system. And I think some of the other benefits, including like the tendon and ligament strength, something that we really don't talk much about anymore. Um, the tendon and ligament strength that you get from that sort of training is unreal. And because you mentioned convict conditioning, I want to point out to people that in convict conditioning too, you wrote the foreword, and I think I had heard about you before because I'd heard about um, dinosaur training. It was always spoken of very, very highly in all the forums that I was on and things like that. And then when I saw your name in there, I thought, oh my gosh, like I didn't know he even knew anything about body weight training. What was it like getting the email from Paul Wade saying that he wanted you to be the guy who wrote the foreword to his upcoming book?
Gosh, I don't remember a reaction, but I was certainly happy to do it. I I was always interested in trying to reach out to as many people as possible,
Mm-hmm.
and was always happy to do things like write a foreword for somebody, or review a book, or whatever. I mean, to my mind, it's a professional courtesy.
Certainly.
And what I don't like is someone who gets into a camp and then they're completely closed-minded to anything else.
Yeah.
I train this way because I follow so-and-so, and so-and-so says to do this,
Yeah.
and don't do this. Okay. It's like, no, that's ridiculous. It's just, you are creating a situation of one training camp versus another,
Mm-hmm.
one trainer versus another. This goes back to, Bob Hoffman selling barbells, has a court battle with Charles Atlas selling bodyweight training. Literally, they end up before the Federal Trade Commission in a lawsuit. Okay.
Yeah.
And leaving aside lawsuits about who's right and who's wrong, I mean, that's not really happening anymore. I mean, Hoffman and Atlas are long gone, but everybody breaks into camps and they become closed-minded. And then they think, okay, the only thing that works is what my camp does.
Yeah.
And so you've got, the people who say do this, the people who say do that, the people who say do this. And some people will listen to that and they'll say, okay, you know what I want to do? I want to try all these different things. And if any of it works, I want to integrate it in my training. Okay. I mean, can you imagine, as a wrestler, if I had 5 moves that I did, or my coach taught 5 moves, and that was all we ever did.
Mm-hmm.
And the coach said, these are the 5 best moves. You're never going to do anything else. Just do these. Okay. Well, obviously, that's not nearly as good as a coach who teaches you many different moves, and the ones that you are most naturally suited to perform best become your bread and butter moves, but you also know the other moves.
Mm-hmm.
And you've tried them, and you haven't had this dogmatic, this dogmatic mindset where, you're like, these are the only moves you ever do. You don't do anything else. And yet we do that in physical training. We do it, all the time. Strength training.
Yeah.
That's the whole world. The whole commercial world of strength training is like that. So, I have tried virtually everything under the sun in my own training. And I write about it all. And I tell people, experiment, find what works best for you, find what you most like, the more tools in your toolkit, the better.
Yeah.
Certainly you want to be in a situation where, during the COVID lockdowns, no gyms, had to stay home. Where are you going to train? How are you going to train? What do you have to train with? And a lot of people rose to that challenge and did really well. They had very successful training times during that period. But some people quit training because they said, well, I don't have a barbell, so I can't train. I don't have a kettlebell, so I can't train. I don't have squat racks, so I can't train, whatever. And that was a time for people to start to explore and to find new and different things to do that would keep them strong, build strength, build muscle, build power, build better conditioning. And there was an opportunity to experiment, and that, to my mind, is what people should be doing all the time.
Yeah.
Not saying we should have lockdowns all the time. I certainly hope that never happens again. I think we all hope that never
You and
happens
me
again.
both. Yeah.
But you need to have an open mind. So the idea of doing something some people thought was very surprising by writing a preface to Convict Conditioning 2, to me, made perfect sense.
Same.
Because it was sort of like, hey guys, try it. You don't have to do it and do it forever, and you don't have to do it exclusively, but try it. And if someone else were to say, Brooks, could you do a preface to this book I'm writing, or this course I'm writing, it's like, well, as long as it's not drug oriented, because I don't go for the drug oriented stuff, it's like, sure, if you'd like me to, be happy to do that. Again, as I say, it's a professional courtesy, and I think it's something that is better for the profession as a whole.
Yeah, I agree.
Sort of like not saying there's only one. Well, it's definitely not saying there's one way and only one way to do things. It's like, here's what I like to do.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what works best for me right now. Try it. Mm-hmm. But I'm not saying it's the only way to train.
Yeah, I try to get people to contextualize stuff like that too, because people will ask me, well, what do you think about this or that or what have you? And, sometimes people are very dogmatic about their approach to certain things. And so I'll just say, that's so-and-so's preference for how they train and how they approach their training. But give it a shot because, it might work for you. It might work for you for a little while, at which point you'll want to move on to the next thing. But I'm the same way, like even though my primary focus is on kettlebells, calisthenics, and movement, I also do stuff with rubber bands. I do stuff with dumbbells, odd objects, ropes when I get a chance. And, I've trained with barbells and stuff like that in the past, and I think it's all great. But ultimately, what you're going to find is that there are going to be certain things that you're going to be naturally drawn to and that you want to do more of, and that you shouldn't be afraid to walk away from it for a little while because your skills in those things are probably not going to just completely go away. And what you might find is by filling gaps in your training and doing something that's a little bit different from what you would otherwise do, when you do go back to what you've done before, you might have like tons new strength and ability levels that you just had no idea were even there previously. So it behooves you to at least try some of these things. And worst case scenario, if you don't get any gains or any progress from it, okay, well, it's not right for you. Doesn't mean it's not right for anybody, but maybe it's just not exactly the best thing for you. But I couldn't agree more. We've got so much time on this planet because people do live nowadays for a very long time, and in all likelihood, barring some sort of a freak accident, most of us are going to live to a ripe old age. So you've got plenty of time to, spend a couple months doing something you normally wouldn't do and just see what happens. Worst case scenario, you have a great story. Yeah, I tried this thing. I was super hopeful and everything sucked afterwards. So I just went back to what I was doing before. No harm, no foul. You'll end up having learned an interesting lesson. You'll get some interesting stories out of it. But no, I got to say, I thought the same thing because a lot of people were a little bit critical of Convict Conditioning, and I thought it was a great book. Convict Conditioning 2, I thought remarkably was even better. It's like the Terminator 2 of calisthenics books. Like somehow managed to be better than the first, which is a rarity for sequels at all. But yeah, it's one of my favorite books on calisthenics training, and I think that you're forward sort of imbuing it with that spirit of an old school exploratory strength training really added like a cherry on top of it. So yeah, it was a super cool thing to see when I cracked the book open for the first time. Um, and before we wrap up, I want to do a couple of rapid fire questions because we've had a great conversation, and I want to ask, what do you, I think we've already touched on it a little bit, and so this will be, in some sense, I think, be a little bit of a summary. But what are some things that you think the old school lifters should have done more of that the modern lifters do more of? And what are some things that modern strength training fanatics should be doing that the old schoolers did just as a matter of course?
Um, I think the really old school lifters, I know what I would say. They were doing almost everything, I think, very well.
Hmm.
Um, they did not do as much speed training,
Mm,
as much, they didn't do plyometrics per se. And speed training and plyometric type training, I think, would have been a good addition in the program.
yeah.
Of course, they did a lot of Olympic lifting. So they were getting some speed training, plyometric work that way. But that was back in the day when a lot of training was slower movements. The military press, um, the bent press, if we go back to the Arthur Saxon era,
Yep.
and um, probably more speed work would have improved their training. Um, Understanding training cycles and learning to train in various ways where they were not always trying to train at their maximum probably would have been better over the long run for many of them.
Yeah.
But otherwise, they were doing, I think, really good training, and there's a lot that we can learn from them. Um, Modern lifters, I think the most important thing that modern lifters can learn from older lifters is the mindset. The mindset in the old days was, if I I can do it. If I train, I can get good results. I can make it happen. I can become hugely bigger, enormously stronger, much better athlete, much better lifter. I mean, the confidence that it can be done. He can do it, I can do it, was huge. Nowadays, most people think there are champions, and then there are people like me, and what's the point,
Yeah.
if you will. So there was a lot of a much different mindset, and I think that that's the thing that the old timers almost universally had, that a lot of people who train nowadays unfortunately don't have, or don't have enough of.
Yeah. They have a little bit less faith, I would say, in the process because why? Because it's hard to say exactly why, but that's the exact issue that I see a lot of too, is that kind of impatience, and people are always looking for a shortcut. And I try to explain, you might say in like colloquial terms, there are certain shortcuts like improve your technique. It's like, oh wow, now suddenly I can lift a lot faster. Well, it's not a shortcut in the sense that you can now bypass the hard work that's going to go into, you know, getting you even stronger. So in a greater sense, there are fast lanes, but you still have to be willing to get behind the wheel and put your foot on the gas and keep it there. Slow down when necessary, in order to make turns, to, go through detours, stuff like that. But yeah, I think that's a big issue, is that people have, as my mentor Pavel Tsatsouline would say, exercise ADD. They always want to jump onto the next thing and not stick with anything for a protracted period of time.
Yeah.
There's a time and a place for that too. It's part of the experimentation process. But over the long run, if you want to get really good at something, you still have to practice that something, at least for a certain period of time. Well, where can people follow you online if they want to keep up to date with your training and, of course, find all your great training resources and books and videos and stuff like that?
Okay. Well, I've got about 30 or 40 titles in the Kindle library.
Nice.
So you can find tons of books and courses in the Kindle library under my name. So just search in Kindle, they all pop up. I've got my own website. It's dinosaurtraining.com. One word, no hyphen, dinosaurtraining.com. And I have links to the Kindle books. I've got links to my hard copy books, links to PDF books and courses, and links to my Dinosaur Files monthly strength training newsletter, which is a really good resource. It's one of the few monthly strength training publications left in the world. Mm-hmm. And I love putting it out because what that does is it lets me stay current, experiment with things, and report on the results, and encourage readers to do the same. And so it's much more current than writing a book every couple of years.
Certainly.
So I think that's a great resource for people. I do daily emails. You can sign up for the daily emails at my website. You can follow me on Facebook or better yet, Instagram. I try to post something on Instagram every day, every couple of days. And if you look on Instagram, you'll see a whole lot of photos and videos about things I do workout-wise here in the state of Washington, Pacific Northwest, training on the beach, doing isometric exercises with driftwood logs, carrying logs, dragging logs, pulling logs, running with logs up and down the beach, all kinds of fun stuff like that, as well as Olympic weightlifting workouts, which I do at the local high school, in the high school weight room, where I also, as a volunteer, am a strength coach for the football team. So, I'm combining a whole lot of different training methods, and they're all reflected on the Instagram site. I actually compete in master's level Olympic lifting now, and am having tons of fun doing that. I hadn't competed since my powerlifting days when I was in my early and mid 30s, and I'm 66 now. So that's just tons of fun. Mm-hmm. And it's fascinating to have made the transition from powerlifting and bench press competitions to Olympic lifting competitions, since they're such different sports.
Yeah.
Vastly different sports. But that's how people can find me. I'm very accessible. You'll find books and courses covering pretty much anything you're interested in. I cover all of it. And if you're not sure where to start, just shoot me an email. info@dinosaurtraining.com gets it to me. And I'll be happy to answer your questions that way.
Very cool. Well, Brooks, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a real pleasure.
Alex, thanks for having me. I've enjoyed it.
And folks, as always, have fun and happy training.